Thank you all very much for joining us, our panel on the Great Global Migration. We have a terrific panel and conversation, but we actually wanted to start with a little bit of show and tell. If we're going to be talking about refugees and migrants, then we should maybe frame this in the terms that matter most, the human terms. And as it happens, the photos that won the Pulitzer Prize this year were of refugees. And so I'd like to quickly run through these slides, which kind of show the human dimensions of what we're talking about. The photos are mostly of Syrian refugees, but also various others on their long journey, sometimes to safety and sometimes not. And I must say that as a journalist who's covered a lot of these issues, covering the refugee crisis left a deep imprint on the reporters and on the photographers who took these. And one of these photos in particular, we'll see of a man who was crying. The photographer was crying as he was taking it. You get numb to many things, but it's hard to get numb to the scale of the human devastation on the refugee trail. And it was ultimately, of course, the photos that moved policy more than perhaps anything else that finally got Europe in particular to move on this issue. This photo always just reminds me of the degree to which everybody was preying on refugees. In Turkey, there were all these stores selling these life jackets, and so many of them were fake. If you'd fall into the water, they wouldn't have done a thing for you or for your child. So that's kind of the human dimensions of it, those slides. And so we have this, you have a wonderful panel that is, people always say that their panelists are so great that they need no introduction. In this case, it's actually true, and we're gonna skip this and jump directly to some comments. Nancy Ossie is the head of the International Medical Corps. She's somebody who is with her staff on the ground. They're operating actually in Syria. And so, Nancy, let me start by maybe asking you about the factors that are forcing people out right now. You have staff in harm's way. Mm-hmm. The very fragile ceasefire in Aleppo seems to be collapsing.
That's right.
Reverting back to war. Is this going to mean a new exodus of refugees fleeing for their lives to Turkey, Greece, wherever they can get?
I absolutely believe it will be a greater number of refugees. So if you think about for a moment, right now today, there are about 60 million people forcibly displaced from their home. This is the most since World War II. A lot of this displacement has happened over the last few years because of the Syria crisis. So if you think about why you would ever want to leave your home if you are living in Syria and it's been your home all of your life, it's your community, your family, when there are no services, when there are no educational services or healthcare services, or there's food insecurity, and you are being targeted by almost everyone, every warring party there is, the lucky people are the ones who manage to get out. So I want to talk to you just real quickly about the situation on the ground in Syria. When warring parties are targeting civilian populations, one of the things that they also do is they target the very health workers that people need to bring their wounded children to. They need these hospitals, they need these clinics. So 75% of the doctors inside Syria have fled the country, fled for their lives. About 50% of the health facilities inside Syria are reduced to rubble. About 750 people, doctors and nurses, have been killed. The life expectancy in Syria has moved from 76 to 56 years old since the start of this war, and it's probably even worse now. You mentioned Aleppo. So we are supporting health workers on the ground, and we are supporting health facilities. But frankly, the health facilities and the health workers, they're Syrian. They belong to the Syrian people. The unsung heroes in Syria is the cardiologist who just 2 weeks ago, the last cardiologist in Hama that was killed. A few days ago, the last pediatrician in Aleppo was killed. One of our doctors that we supported was captured, tortured, and also killed. So the health workers inside Syria are taking a tremendous risk, and the people inside Syria who can get out are trying to do so because there are not enough health facilities, there's not enough food, and the very people who are helping them are being targeted on a daily basis.
And I mean, I think it's an important point to make that in so many of these countries, not just Syria, the real heroes are so often the local people who stay and risk their lives trying to keep alive their countrymen of whatever sect or...
Right. They risk their lives, and as you say, Nick, they are risking the lives of their children, their families. Not only are they targeted, but their families are targeted. So if you think for a moment about how much our families mean to us, sometimes we say, if I were in that situation, I would hope that I would stay. I would hope I wouldn't flee. I would hope I would stay in that hospital and work and risk my life as that pediatrician in Aleppo did. The other question, though, we'd have to ask ourselves is, would I be willing to risk the life of my child? That is really the core of the question, because the heroic health workers that you mentioned in Syria or in Yemen or around the world are risking the lives of their families every single day because they have become targets.
And you alluded to this, but I mean, not just in Syria, but worldwide, health workers have become targets. That it used to be that fighting was among combatants, and then people decided to target civilians, and now in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Central African Republic, combatants are targeting doctors to make conditions impossible for people and drive them away.
Well, so International Medical Corps, we were founded in the mid-'80s, and it was a result of the Soviet Union doing exactly what you just said, Nick. They were targeting the civilian population, and they were trying to wound a child because they knew that an Afghan family would take a wounded child to the border and get refugee help. And if they could deny people health services inside the country, it would serve to just throw people outside the country. And so we've seen since those days, over the last 30 years, organizations, not just us, but other organizations like International Rescue Committee and other groups, what we have seen is a deliberate targeting of health workers so that people leave the country. So we certainly saw that in places like Somalia. I think during the Balkans War, which I know you covered well, we saw that the Serbian Milosevic and his Serbian militia targeted journalists because they talked too much about what was happening, and they targeted health workers. And so we have seen the targeting of health workers at a scale that we've never seen before. And this is why we have 60 million people displaced throughout the world, like you said, in places, Yemen or the Congo, places throughout the world. That's why we have so many refugees right now. There are people running and fleeing for their lives, but more importantly, for the lives of their children.
David, as head of the International Rescue Committee, you too have people in harm's way on the ground all over the world. And I mean, there are a lot of these people who don't particularly want to come to Europe or to America. They want to be in, perhaps Lebanon, where they have family, relatives. And yet we as an international community have failed to provide them with support and services inexpensively in those neighboring countries, which is one reason we drive them to Europe. What went wrong? Why do we fail so badly at doing what would be more cheap and more humanitarian?
Well, look, I think Nancy has spoken brilliantly about the scale of the exodus that is driving 20 million people across borders, 40 million people from their homes within their countries of origin. The point I want to make is that people are fleeing in different ways to different places than before. It's really important that you get your head around the fact that 60% of the world's refugees are not in a refugee camp, which is the iconic image of a refugee. 60% of refugees today are in urban areas. So the phenomenon of urbanization that is discussed elsewhere in this conference in the context of what globalization means today, it applies to refugees as well. And the duration of displacement has gone from the assumption of temporary displacement for a few years to now an average displacement for a refugee of 17 years. That's probably the most shocking statistic I've learned in my 2 years running the International Rescue Committee. We're a charity that works in 30 war zones, fragile states, and we do refugee resettlement in the US. So we see the whole arc of crisis. Like Nancy, we've got 2,000 staff in Syria. But I think it's also important to emphasize that most of the world's refugees are not actually in the Middle East. Most of them are in Africa. It's an untold story. I'm glad no one has today referred to a quote-unquote European refugee crisis, because there is, in fact, a Middle Eastern refugee crisis, an African refugee crisis, a South Asian refugee crisis. Rich countries bear a very small share of the burden. And the truth about the Lebanon-Jordan situation, but also the Kenya-Ethiopia situation, is that the humanitarian sector isn't set up for the kind of long-term urban displacement that is a feature of modern life. We're an organization that's a $700 million organization. The average duration of displacement for a refugee is 17 years. The average grant length for one of the 500 grants that we manage is 11 months. So we have a system of temporary band-aids in the context of structural displacement that is long-term. And so when you think about an issue like education, which you briefly referred to in your question, 200,000 Syrian kids in Lebanon are in school, but 200,000 kids are not in school. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is finance. The Syria appeal by the UN is about 45 to 50% funded. Secondly, schools are full. They've got some double shifts in a lot of Lebanese schools. But also, frankly, there has been a refusal on the part of the international community to embrace community-based education supplements or complements to the mainstream education system that organizations like ours deliver. So there's been a bureaucratization that is partly the fault of the donors and partly to do with local politics that has got in the way. And I think David, one has to think about those structural issues as well as the funding issues.
And David, when we as an international community fail to educate those Syrian kids who are in neighboring countries, 4.5 million kids or something, 4.5 million people, then presumably we are then creating the next generation of, risking the next generation of jihadis, the next generation of Syrian instability.
Yeah, look, one's got to be careful, because it's dangerous to say 4 million Muslims flee Syria, 2 million of them are kids. If we don't give them education, they're going to become jihadis. I mean, one's got to beware that sort of logic. But Madeleine Albright, I think, talked about the situation in Lebanon being a petri dish for radicalization. And so there's no inevitability, but hopelessness, despair, abuse, exploitation, which become the features of daily life for kids Lebanon's an interesting example. We run a program for street kids in Beirut. The dangers of hopelessness and boredom, never mind abuse and exploitation, are very, very significant. And it's certainly the case that long-term conflicts, I'm going to the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya next week. It's the largest refugee camp in the world in eastern Kenya with Somali refugees. There's no doubt that in that context, the Kenyans have very serious concerns about infiltration by al-Shabaab and others into the refugee situation. So if your question is it politically stupid as well as immoral to neglect the refugees who are displaced around the world? Yes, it is. There is an instrumental case for investment in fragile states, not just a moral case.
Paul, you've, as an economist, you have looked at all kinds of issues, and now you're focused indeed on refugees. You've been spending a lot of time in Jordan, and you are, I believe, working on a book about refugee issues. So to the extent that there now seems to be a certain recognition that the refugee system globally is just broken, I mean, is it Is that going too far? Is that fair to say? And how do we rebuild it?
Yeah, I think it's the last vestiges of the post-war international architecture. It's the one that hasn't been reformed. Every part of the post-war international architecture at some stage got modernized, except this. And this is still designed for a post-war situation where refugees were there for a few months, in which case what did you need? You needed refuge, literally in the sense of you needed shelter and food. Where was a good place to do that? A camp. And as David said, most refugees don't go to camps because they know that in a longer context, the most important thing is not food and shelter, it's autonomy, it's the preservation of basic human dignity through being able to control your own life. And inadvertently, camps infantilize people. I mean, they die not of malnutrition, but of a lack of freedom and indeed of boredom. I remember talking to a family in the biggest camp in Jordan, Zaatari, and there was the 16-year-old boy. I said, what do you do? Are you at school? No. All I do is housework for my mother. Got any brothers? Yeah, 18-year-old brother. What's he do? Oh, he went back to Syria. What's he doing back in Syria? Don't ask. Right? So what's needed is to take refugee policy out of this humanitarian silo where it's been stuck ever since 1950, and it needs to be integrated with economic development strategies. There's a big effort now, fragile states, post-conflict recovery, but it's completely separated from refugee policy. This is absurd. Refugees, first and foremost, need jobs. If they were provided with jobs, then that could not only give them human dignity whilst they're refugees, but it would incubate the post-conflict economy before we've got back to peace. And all these societies at some stage do get back to peace. And then what do refugees want? The core ambition of refugees is not to be migrants and come to California, nice as California is. Their core ambition is to go home in peace. They've not voluntarily left home to come to California. They've been forced out of their home because they're unsafe. And so the conflation of refugees with migration is itself a mistake.
And you've also done, when you were chief economist at the World Bank, you did a lot of work on conflict resolution and the costs of conflicts. And indeed, doesn't the broken refugee system reflect, in turn, a broken system for reconciling conflicts early on, especially in developing countries? Right now you look at South Sudan falling apart. You look at Burundi, perhaps on the edge of on the abyss of genocide. You look at
yeah, I think we've got a very unserious model of what basically politically in fragile states, what should happen and what post-conflict should look like. Basically, I think needs to look like power sharing in which different groups work together politically rather than a sort of winner-take-all election which produces a winner and a loser, and the loser is unreconciled and the winner uses power to exploit the losers for their own benefit. So there's a political approach in post-conflict that needs to be embraced as power sharing. And there's a much more serious economic engagement post-conflict. We've now understood that it's hard to get post-conflict societies to grow economically because private sector is wary of going there, but without the private sector, these places won't grow. And so we need actually to use public money to incentivize private enterprise to go to places where it's not particularly keen to go, but where it will be really, really useful. So this idea of taking jobs to the refugees is one way in which the private sector can actually incubate post-conflict recovery whilst doing it at complete safety. So, for example, Jordan has committed to 150,000 work permits for Syrian refugees for new jobs brought into industrial zones. The zones are there already. What's needed is European firms to actually, we need chief executives to fly to these industrial zones and see what they can do. Let's use economic globalization to work for these crisis opportunities. The miracle of globalization is that it can actually do that. It can actually make refugees productive in industrial zones near to the source of the conflict.
Peter Laharn is head of the Hilton Foundation. You've looked a lot at these issues, and I think that there are a lot of us who would like to believe that 60 million displaced people is kind of a blip. It's a function of unrest in Syria or Afghanistan and so on. But you argue that this is the new normal.
In fact, I think we're looking at a century of dislocation, and we need to start acting in that way and building our infrastructure in that way. You've heard from David and from Nancy that 60 million people are either refugees or internally displaced. That's about 1% of the population of the Earth. About 40,000 people are displaced every day by conflict and violence. And 250 million people are living outside their countries of origin, which is a historic high. That's on the conflict and violence side. But I think what we need to factor in, and what certainly wasn't factored in the post-World War II environment, is climate change in the environment. We're seeing now more than 50,000 people displaced per week by climate-related factors, or by disasters, and 90% of those disasters are climate-related. If you saw Vice President Gore's presentation yesterday, you saw him referring to the fact that it was the collapse of Syrian agriculture having to do with climate change that led 1.5 million people into the cities and led to part of the destabilization of Syria. If you look now, disasters are becoming more destructive than they were. The damage to the built environment annually these days is about $300 billion, but it's supposed to be going up to about $400 billion in 2030. And if you look at the humanitarian architecture right now, about 80% of the funding is spent on if you like, conflict-related displacement, and about 20% on disasters. The importance of climate change and environment in the movement of people is going to grow dramatically over this century, and I think we are not currently ready for it. Those are the push factors. I think there also is an important pull factor.
I've got to say, this is a really cheery panel.
Sorry.
You know, if you think it's bad now, just wait.
Well, forewarned is forearmed, I think. There's also a pull factor. I think it is a lot easier now in the connectivity of the world for people anywhere to see themselves as people elsewhere and to see the other specific destinations as attractive. And the globalization is also, of course, the movement of people. Right now, we're seeing the movement across borders in the Middle East and Europe, but they're certainly not the only ones that are likely to be crossed by people in search of a better life. And I think the remaining piece of the puzzle, as Sir Paul was saying, is that the global system, the UN system in particular, is not set up in order to deal with this. It's set up for lower volumes of displacement, it's set up for shorter durations, and it doesn't take climate into account at all. And that is one of the reasons why at the end of this month, many countries of the world are coming together at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, hoping to put in place a system that is better prepared for the realities of the future.
And I mean, indeed, actually, one of the Twitter trends today was climate refugee because of an article in the New York Times about domestic people moving from coastal areas near New Orleans. But it's kind of a way of thinking about this broader problem. And I suppose one may have Zika virus refugees from Central America or
Indeed.
Haiti. Do you see this as something that will rise? You know, what is the trajectory ahead? Do you want to, just between us, you want to take a guess?
I think it's safe to say that it will grow to displace conflict-caused migration, and that some of the the most fragile economies of the world are also in the most arid areas of the world. If you look at the Sahel, you look at South Asia, and I think it's safe to say that development gains that we've known are likely to be lost in the coming years. One of the connection I would like to make is between the humanitarian issues today and the Sustainable Development Goals that have just been approved by all of the countries of the world. The Sustainable Development Goals are basically our global homework for getting things right in this century. For us to stop fouling our own nest, for us to get some handle on climate and environment issues, and for us to give everyone an opportunity and a stake in well-being. And I think in the long run, the Sustainable Development Goals are what will be quite helpful in reducing the need for humanitarian action. Because if all those goals are met, many of the drivers of displacement and of migration will be reduced. But at the same time, unless we tackle the humanitarian situation forthrightly, it's likely to derail the progress we want to make on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think also as we look at both the goals themselves, the targets, and the indicators, migration and refugees are not nearly as prominent as they should be, and we need to bring those two agendas together.
David, you have been, more than anybody I can think of, a passionate advocate for Western countries being more generous in accommodating refugees and responding to refugees globally. And I admire that. But when I first met you, you were a politician, you were a foreign minister, and I wonder if you were still a politician, would you be as willing to call upon citizens to open their doors? I mean, one looks in Britain, and it looks as if refugees perhaps are one factor among many that may make people more inclined toward a Brexit.
Yeah. The point I make is that the UK's current overseas aid commitment is exemplary. It puts to shame countries like the US. 0.7% of national income in the UK goes to overseas aid compared to 0.21% in the US. But in respect of refugee resettlement, the UK allows 6 refugees per parliamentary constituency from Syria. And the point I make is there's no way you can persuade me that 6 refugees in my community of South Shields in the northeast of England is going to overwhelm the community. And I think, frankly, I could make the case for that South Shields could take more than that. And if you're I think there is a case not for quote unquote open doors. No one argues that any country can take everyone. But if you look at the country like Canada, I mean, the new government came in. It said, right, let's stop messing around. 25,000 refugees a year in Canada from Syria. The US figure is now 10,000 a year, so just to get it in perspective.
10,000, and we have only admitted 1,600 so far this fiscal year.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think it's the case that all politicians are cowards on this. I mean, the example of Justin Trudeau, but actually also a Conservative government in Australia, long seen as opposing refugee resettlement. The Turnbull government said 12,000 refugees should come to Australia. The truth is, in economist jargon, this is support for refugees is a global public good, and it has to be treated as such. Most refugees will not end up coming to rich third countries. They're not going to end up in the US, Canada, or Australia. But if 10 or 15% do, who are the number who are most vulnerable, most in need of specialist support, most able to make a go of it in the countries to which they're coming, because, for example, there are Syrian American communities around the US that can support those people, then the flip side of the coin is that we are not just offering substantive solidarity with countries like Kenya or Jordan, we're actually symbolically standing with them. And what's striking, if you talk to the Jordanians, Jordan is the second closest ally of the US in the Middle East. And if you talk to the Jordanians, they say, yes, we do want more aid, but we also want you to stand with us. We want you to reform the aid system in the kind of way that Paul has said. At the moment, he didn't get a chance to say this, but it's staggering. The World Bank is not allowed to work in Jordan at the moment, even though 1 in 8 of the population is a refugee, because it's classified as a middle-income country. Talk about a residue of a post-war system that's broken, or a post-war system of mandates that are broken. And remember, just in parenthesis, For every one of us who's saying the World Bank should be allowed to work in Jordan, there are countries saying, hang on, that means the World Bank may have less to give to me, so I'm going to be leery of allowing the World Bank to make that move. So it's contested. But the Jordanians also say, we need to tell our own populations that you, the West, are also taking refugees. And I don't think it's an impossible argument to make, and we can talk about the security and other issues, but look at what Mrs. Merkel's doing in Germany. There you see what happens if you don't have a plan. She woke up last July, and there were already 500,000 Syrians in the country.
I mean, but Angela Merkel is also an interesting example in that I really admired the compassion that she showed, and boy, she has taken a hit for it politically.
Yeah, but I love saying this to people. She's taken a hit. My God, she lost 20% of her popularity. What is her popularity today? 48%. I mean, most of us will give quite a lot to have a popularity rating of 48%. She's still the dominant figure in German politics. And so people want to know that their leaders have a plan, but they also want to know that their leaders are able to be clear about what they stand for. And it's true that she's taken a big hit. It's true that German politics has polarized, but it's polarized around her. And my position or my pitch to you would be, don't buy this argument that there's a simple quote-unquote backlash against refugees. It's true that in this country, I observe a lot of noise of angry people who say they don't want refugees, but I also know that every office that we've got around the US has people coming to offer help in unprecedented numbers. And that's why I talk about a polarization of politics, not simply a backlash on this refugee issue.
Well, let me broaden the discussion. I mean, it sure seems to me that the attacks that President Obama has faced for accepting a mere 1,600 refugees reflects a real fear in this country. You look at polling, and Americans and Poles say they don't want refugees, and a lot of it has is somewhat Islamophobic tinge to it. I must say that it almost exactly mirrors the polling in 1939.
Yeah.
In 1939, Americans were asked, do you want to accept 10,000 mostly Jewish refugees?
Yeah.
And Americans, by a 2-to-1 ratio, said, no, we don't want those kids. And of course, we turned back to St. Louis and sent the ship to St. Louis, which was full of refugees from Europe, and sent them back to Europe in many cases to die in the Holocaust. But how people are scared.
Yes.
How do we deal with that?
You know, I think that the historical context you bring is very important, because many times I look back over time and I say, you know, if I was alive during the Holocaust, would I have done the right thing? If I was old enough during the civil rights movements in the U.S., would I have done the right thing? And I always tell myself, I would have spoken up. I would have done the right thing. All those other people that... But, you know, when you're in the heat of the moment and you introduce this concept of fear, reactions are very different. I mean, when people say, listen, I feel compassion, I want to help, but not if it's going to get my child killed. So I think sometimes the harsh reality is we have to look at ourselves today and the world that we live in today, and we have to face our fears. We have to do that, because so much, I think, of what drives our wrong behavior at times as human beings is when we are afraid. We often use fear as the reason we don't do something. And I think that it's a very dangerous thing. We see it play out in politics. We know how politically effective the use of fear is. And yet we always think that we would have been the person that didn't act from fear, but act out of principle and moral conviction and courage. And I want to talk a little bit about courage, because you mentioned something earlier about the heroic people inside these countries. So I want to mention Yemen for a moment. So Yemen is a country. There's about 26 million people in Yemen. 14 million of them have very little access to food or to health care, and 21 million are in need of some kind of humanitarian assistance. So we have about 150 people in Yemen, local people working there. And I just want to bring a voice in very quickly from Yemen. It's from Doha, one of our humanitarian workers there. And she has a blog, and she writes, "This lack of security weighs heavily on my mood, especially when a bomb explodes suddenly or when someone is assassinated. I still have flashbacks about what I experienced during the battle for Aden last year. They make me cry. I also feel horrible after any assassination or explosion. I try to keep my focus on my work with International Medical Corps, which is valuable at this time. I'm now able to buy all the basic needs for my 2.5-year-old son. But I have to worry about him because of all that is going around us. Explosions, assassinations, shootings that could hurt him at any day. Schools for older children are open, but they miss many days because of sudden outbreaks of fighting or other general instability in the city. Although the work and the heavy fighting has moved on from Aden, I still cannot move freely, and the situation remains fraught with danger. So what does that mean? That means every single day, thousands of people around the world, thousands of people working with groups like our group, are putting their lives on the line, staying in their countries, and they don't want to be refugees. I was in Jordan recently, and I was at one of the camps, and I met a young woman and her mother. She had just escaped from a holding area. It's a no man's land between Syria and Jordan. There's about 50,000 people in this area who have fled ISIS, trying to get into Jordan, and Jordan is accepting the men every single day. When you think about what it would take for a mother to leave a war that she has survived so far for 5 years and become a refugee. So what we have to do is we have to stop the flow of refugees. As Peter said earlier, that these flows are continuing and more people are coming. We have to go to the heart of the issue. We have to do something better to try to stop the violence. There are people every single day risking their lives, trying to stay in their communities and trying to help their people so that they don't become a refugee. And so the solution lies within these countries, and it lies on getting not only humanitarian assistance where it's needed so people can stay, but to ending the fighting, to coming up with political solutions that are real and lasting, not as the one that we've seen recently because of all the violence in Aleppo.
Nick.
Yeah.
Just you indicated I was being a bit of a downer before, so I think I can give something positive on this. Our foundation was founded by the man who built this hotel, Conrad Hilton. The same time that this hotel went up in the 1950s, he also built hotels in Istanbul, in Cairo, and in Rabat. And he looked at those places as bridges of understanding. He always said, if people can come together for coffee, they'll start to understand one another, and they'll realize the work that they have to do together. And he was a very strong believer in international trade and commerce as a way to build peace and understanding. And I think we have to take some courage these days and say that the threats that face us, whether it be ISIS or Al-Qaeda, are small compared to the magnitude of people who are with us. There are 1 billion Muslims in this world, and their desires are very much aligned with the desires of the people of Europe and the United States. And I think we should all commit to taking a positive attitude toward building bridges and to making it possible to come together in ways that build our future. My perspective is that the work of our species in this century is to get control over the degradation that we've allowed to happen. And in order to do that, we need to be able to prevent and reduce conflicts.
And given Peter's connection with Hilton Hotels, if you have any concerns about your room, then reach out. Let me mention another refugee, World War II refugee, Vladislav Krzyzewowicz, left Romania, spent a couple years in a concentration camp in Yugoslavia, ended up in France, tried to get to the U.S., tried a fake marriage to an American citizen. That fell through, but eventually was sponsored by a church in the U.S., got permission to come, changed his name from Krzyzewowicz to Christoph, who's my dad. I deeply, and I think my columns, reflect this desire to be more welcoming to refugees and recognition of the degree to which refugees enrich our country. But I've got to say that I also look at how the debate has played out in this country and in Europe, and the degree to which this has strengthened some politicians in both countries who leave me aghast, in both continents who leave me aghast. And also, I think back to Elan Kurdi's body, the kid who was washed up on the beach in Turkey. And I sometimes wonder if those of us who were bleeding hearts and championing Elan Kurdi, we ended up leading more refugee families to leave their countries, in some cases to drown, now to get stuck in Turkey for years to come. And I don't know what to think about this, but I guess I wonder whether our political capital might be more effective, and maybe I'll ask you this, more effective not getting in these fights about how many refugees we should take, but in doing more to address the push factors in countries abroad and in providing the kind of education, housing support, financial support in other countries in the region, whether that isn't maybe a better place to direct political capital.
Nicholas, I passionately agree with that. And let me tell you, in my little book, The Bottom Billion, the emblematic country of distress was the Central African Republic. And that was because when I was at the World Bank, my last phase at the World Bank, I tried to work with a Prime Minister of the Central African Republic who wanted to reform, and he was looking for help. And he'd got this nightmare situation. The country was $2 million in arrears. Yes, $2 million in arrears to the World Bank and the fund. And because of that, the World Bank and the IMF could not engage. I went to the Central African Republic. There was no staff from the World Bank. There was no staff from the IMF. None had been for at least a year. When I got off the plane, there were cameras there because I was the celebrity. The Prime Minister had the agony each month of deciding, do I pay the civil service or do I try and pony up some money to service this debt? So I went round trying to raise $2 million to clear the arrears so that legally the IMF and the World Bank could re-engage. And I could not raise from the international community $2 million.
You should have come here. You should have come to this conference. You could have sorted that out.
This was
Seriously?
2003, right? $2 million we were short for Central African Republic. Now we roll on. What happened 10 years later, Central African Republic became a full-blown failed state.
Exactly.
With a massive humanitarian crisis. Now the donors are approaching me saying, what do we do in Central African Republic? Can you advise us? If I could come up with a simple solution where it costs $2 billion, I think I could pony up the $2 billion now because it's a crisis, it's in their face, they want to do something. So passionately, we need to smart up to prevention of these situations. At the moment, across the Sahel, it's desperately fragile. This is potentially the next Afghanistan, but even closer to Europe. So, in its own interest, never mind the compassion. One of the themes of the Bottom Billion was that compassion and enlightened self-interest very often point in the same direction, and what they point to is it's not about taking 1 million or 10 million from these countries. It's giving a future for the people in these countries. The solution to Yemen is not that 26 million people leave Yemen. It's that Yemen has a future.
Right.
And that's the challenge that we need
Let's
to
just go back, though, because, Nick, you're, if I may say so, in danger of a degree of self-loathing that is completely unmerited. I mean, the idea that those of us who said that Aylan Kurdi's picture showed the need for more effective intervention in the Syrian conflict are somehow then responsible for subsequent events. No. I mean, the truth about the Aylan Kurdi thing is, first, it didn't actually change much government policy. It's not that there was a before Aylan Kurdi moment and an after Aylan Kurdi moment. If you look at aid flows, if you look at refugee resettlement, not that much has changed. Secondly, the push factors that are driving people out of war zones are far, far greater than the pull factors of the different welfare benefits. What they know is they're better off in Europe than they are in Syria. And frankly, you or I would be doing exactly the same thing. We'd be mad not to at the moment. I think the point that Nancy and that Paul are pointing to is not that it's wrong to highlight that sort of terrible picture as an example of human failure. It's that the politics of external intervention in wars is extremely difficult at the moment because the West is humbled by its failings in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Russians are in their pomp because of the way in which they've been able to reframe the battlefield in Syria. The Chinese are on the side watching. Despite the fact they've got massive investment across Africa, they're not, and they're big supporters of UN peacekeeping, including with their own troops, much more than Western countries. But the appetite for international anchoring of stabilization forces in war zones is much reduced. And if in fact that's what you're saying, I think that's a real debate. But don't blame yourself or others for the coverage that you gave for the Aylan Kurdi moment. In fact, my argument would have been you should have given far more coverage, because the truth is not enough has changed.
Peter, you cited on this notion of kind of prevention or reducing exit factor, you cited some powerful numbers in a phone call earlier that the amount of money spent on humanitarian assistance versus what is spent on conflict prevention.
Right. It's about $25 billion a year on humanitarian assistance and about $200 million a year on peace building. We are very much hoping that at the World Humanitarian Summit, some sort of rebalancing of that, along with strategies that make sense, would be a tremendous investment.
And another context is, on top of the $25 billion for humanity, also close to $2 trillion globally on military spending globally, which is
$20 billion was spent by Facebook to buy WhatsApp. That is a far more relevant statistic than the idea that we start raiding the humanitarian budget. Talk about raiding Peter to pay Paul. 0.013% of global GDP is spent on humanitarian aid. So let's not think that the way to resolve the peacekeeping issues or the conflict building issues, the conflict prevention and peace building issues, is to raid the humanitarian budget.
Obviously.
And also, I just want to say something about, so when we think about the little boy washed up on the beach, when it comes to a natural disaster like we saw in Nepal, in fact, International Medical Corps and Facebook partnered around that, and they raised about $18 million off their platform because everyone could relate to the images that they were seeing that were playing out because they understand a natural disaster and they understand an earthquake. Conflict is tricky. When governments, as David just pointed out, when governments don't do enough to step forward, we can't necessarily rely on the private sector. I know that the Hilton Foundation has been very generous toward refugees and much of the Middle East crises, and a few in the private sector and individuals have. But people don't generally give to a conflict because they can't understand it. They can't get their irons around it. They can't relate to it. Images like the boy that washed up on the beach, work like what you do, Nick, compels people to be compassionate and compels them to give the support. But the fact of the matter is, as much as the U.S. government is doing, and they've been very generous, other governments have as well, as much as individuals and the private sector may try to do, it's not enough, and conflicts especially are difficult because people can't relate to them, they don't understand them, and therefore they tend to disengage financially in a way that they don't when it comes to a natural disaster.
I'd like to broaden the conversation. We have a couple of mics here. If you have questions you'd like to put people on the spot with or challenge anybody here, concerns about your room.
Room services. Yeah.
Then please raise your hand, and their mic runners are going to come and somebody's approaching you. We only have about 6 minutes left, so
be quick.
Please ask briefly.
Be quick. Thank you all for that wonderful discussion. If we assume that you're right, that one of the great failings of our response to the refugee crisis has been around jobs and employment, Why is that? Is it because businesses, chief executives who don't go to your industrial zone and zones in Lebanon, are they cold-hearted? Is it that politicians aren't able to apply pressure to business? Is it that the humanitarian sector isn't tooled sufficiently to engage in a substantive discussion with business? Why is that? And specifically for each of you, what's the one thing that you would do to try and encourage the private sector to engage and think of creative solutions to the jobs crisis?
I would jump in by saying that many times, and like in the case of Syria, if you look at the Syrian refugees or people who've immigrated over the years, they're entrepreneurs, they're great doctors and nurses. People that come to countries have a lot to contribute and a lot of value to add. I mean, you just given the example earlier, Nick. But I would just say that we need to view refugees that come into countries not as a liability and not as victims, but as people who are really glad to be there and who want to do their part to live the dream and to contribute, as we've seen over and over again in countries like the U.S. that have received many refugees over the year. So I would view them as an asset and an opportunity to engage, whether it's in companies or hospitals or whatever, and as adding human capital to those particular countries.
Yeah, kind of add a bit. I mean, at the moment, when companies hear refugee, they shove it off to corporate social responsibility and send some blankets. What they need to do is realize that by doing their core business, making globalization work, they can actually benefit both themselves and refugees. Now, in the process, other bits have to work as well. So, for example, in Jordan, a key bit was that the European community change its market access rules so that products made in these industrial zones could be sold into Europe. Europe's just done that, right? So the reasons for not going to look are gradually falling away. The World Bank has just come up, it's got $1 billion to actually put in these zones. And David, your point about the World Bank not being able to engage was absolutely right, but it was such a scandal that it's just been changed.
Indeed.
And October it will be changed.
Yeah, which is yeah. I mean, it's but we've done it by giving that issue profile. Things have actually changed. So at last, so it's a mindset thing and it's a coordination thing. But first and foremost, we need CEOs on planes go and look. There's a small town in Turkey, central Turkey, which 10 years ago was nothing. Now it produces over half of the world's synthetic carpets. If that can be done in Turkey, in a nowhere town, it can be done in any of these industrial zones. So modern globalization really has got the scope to take jobs to refugees, rather than just define the problem as a humanitarian solution of take the refugees to the jobs.
We're down to 2.5 minutes, so another question.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Shihata. I'm from Egypt. What I've noticed in the conference in a couple of sessions is that whenever the refugee crisis is talked about, or ISIS, or terrorism, there's a complete denial that the West had anything to do with these problems. It's like the Middle East and these people leaving. Nobody wants to leave their home. I wish that, the West would understand that. Nobody willingly leaves their lives to go uproot, and nobody willingly goes to kill themselves for a political cause. It is because of wars, dictators funded by the West, or foreign intervention that we have all these problems in the Middle East. And for those of you who deal with governments and people so involved in the refugee crisis, do you also try to make them understand the responsibility? It's not just compassion. There's a responsibility for these refugees that the West has to now house them. These are innocent victims of policies that they are just, victims of.
We're down to about a minute. Why don't we have about 15 seconds each, just kind of your response to that, or a brief takeaway for folks. Peter.
You know, we haven't gone so much with governments into responsibility, but I think we have gone into the enlightened self-interest. Normally, we would make grants for direct services, but this time we've decided it's more important for us to make grants that advocate for the governments of Europe and the States to complement the money that Turkey, for example, has become the third largest donor in the world and has put in $7.5 billion into supporting refugees. And we feel that it's important for Europe and the United States to complement that. And I think that, I hope that responds in to some degree in terms of restitution, if you like.
David?
Some refugee crises have a big Western component, but others don't. And the Syria crisis, if anything, is a story of the absence of Western intervention, not the story of Western intervention. It's homegrown, it's home nurtured, it's regionally fertilized, and then the geopolitics has not been from the West. And we deliver 360,000 people's healthcare in southwestern Syria around Daraa, which is where the fighting started. And it started with people not asking for a revolution, but asking for a bit of dignity. And that wasn't a Western invention. It was a Syrian story that followed. 10 years before that, the Damascus Spring in 2005 was 250 intellectuals speaking up for the ability to write and think what they wanted, and that ran into the sand. And I'm afraid that 10 years later, the sense of it was the reaction of the Assad regime to the demands of their own people that has created a civil war that's become a regional conflagration, not a Western invention. So yes, we should be responsible, but no, we shouldn't fall into blaming ourselves for everything, especially where we're not actually engaged.
Paul,
Yeah,
final thought.
I'm suspicious of narratives which make us the origin of everything. Everything seems to turn into something about us. And let me say, there are actually 10 countries in the world which are overwhelmingly and repeatedly providing the haven for refugees. None of those 10 countries is a rich country, but they are proximate to the conflict zones. And our primary responsibility is to make it automatic that those 10 countries, which necessarily bear the haven role, don't have to bear the financial burden. And shamefully, with the Syrian crisis, we didn't do that. Shamefully, this was Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey paying up. And it hit Jordan very hard. That's why we need to reform the international refugee system in a way that brings economics at the core of a functional solution.
Just want to say very quickly, U.S. government, the UK government, other governments around the world, the Conrad Hilton Foundation, J.P. Morgan, there's been a number of philanthropists in the private sector on the U.S. side that have stepped up and tried to do the right thing, the compassionate thing, the responsible thing. I, too, am always very suspect of anything that paints kind of a black and white picture around blame. I think that when we look at, in one situation, people say we didn't intervene enough, and other ones we intervened too much. If you look at the trend lines over the years, there's many times when the West intervened and the West got blamed, the West didn't intervene, the West got blamed. I don't think we can, I think it's too convenient and too oversimplified to blame the West. And more importantly, I don't think it gets us anywhere. I think we have to start focusing on what do we do now and what did we do in the future, because we may never get it just right, and we don't always know what would have happened had our response been different. But when we fall into blaming, then people tend to retract and they don't focus on the solutions. And I think that's where we should stay focused at this point.
My takeaway would be that throughout history, we've always been kind of afraid of refugees. And whenever we're afraid, we tend to make bad policy. In the New York Times, I came across an editorial we ran expressing this sort of tremendous fear of Irish immigrants in the late 19th century. In the late 1930s, early 1940s, there was a State Department official named Breckinridge Long who systematically barred European Jews from getting refugee status in the U.S. Anne Frank's family applied twice, or sought twice, to get refugee status in the U.S. We repeatedly feared what we don't understand, and as a result have tended to come up with really lousy policy. And to me, that's one of the overarching lessons of history on this. Thank you very much for joining our conversation. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.